The snow had begun to rot. It melted not in rivers, but in whispers, dripping through cracks and hollows, until the mountain exhaled the scent of mud and pine. Beneath the ridge, where shadows had clung for 6 long months, an old brown bear stirred for the first time since autumn. The den was a scar in the hillside, half collapsed by frost. His breath rose in small clouds that hung in the still air, refusing to leave. The bear lifted his head slowly, blinking against the light that spilled through the narrow mouth of the cave. His fur was matted, his sides hollow. The hunger that had slept beside him all winter woke with him now, patient and absolute. He pushed himself forward until his shoulders scraped stone. Outside, the world was changing color, the dull blue of winter fading into the raw, wet green of thaw. He stepped into the open, his paws sinking deep into slush. The ground was soft and trembling under the weight of meltwater. Each footfall made a sound like the breaking of old breath. He paused, head tilted slightly, and listened. The forest below was still silent, as if waiting for its own heartbeat to return. The ravens had not yet begun their arguments. The rivers had not yet found their voices. Only the steady dripping from the trees broke the quiet. The bear stood there, unmoving, and when he finally began to walk, the earth seemed to answer him. The soil shifted faintly with each step, as though remembering a rhythm older than the snow that had buried it. He descended through a slope of birch and alder, the trunks thin and silver. Patches of moss showed where the snow had melted first, small islands of green among the white. The bear stopped to nose the ground, searching for roots, beetles, anything. He found nothing. The hunger inside him deepened, but he did not hurry. His pace remained slow, deliberate. He knew the land better than hunger. It was the same valley he had walked as a cub, the same ridge where his mother had taught him to dig for bulbs beneath the thaw. The air smelled of larch resin, melting ice, and something else. Faint, distant, unfamiliar. A new scent that did not belong to the forest. Oil, iron, the bitter tang of fuel. The bear lifted his head. His breath steamed. Somewhere far below, something human was moving. The sound came to him not as noise, but as a vibration. The dull hum of machinery carried through thawing ground. The bear's ears twitched. He turned his head toward the valley and stood for a long while listening. He did not growl, did not run. He simply listened, his body still except for the slow movement of his breath. Then he began walking again, down toward the sound. Far below, where the valley widened and the snow had already turned to thick mud, Dr. Ilya Morozov traced a line on the ground with his boot. He was tall, stooped from years of fieldwork, his beard streaked with gray. The morning light made the frost on his jacket glitter. He knelt to adjust a sensor buried half in mud, its wire leading back to a humming machine under a tarp. From the ridge came the faint crack of ice falling from trees. Ilya barely noticed. He had been listening all morning to another kind of noise. The seismograph inside the tent had been shivering since dawn. Faint, regular pulses from beneath the earth. Not strong enough to be tectonic, not random enough to be wind. It came and went like breathing. He'd checked the calibration twice, replaced the wire once. Still, the pattern remained. A rhythm that rose, paused, and rose again. His assistant Nina appeared behind him, pulling her parka tighter around her shoulders. "You're still staring at that thing?" she asked, nodding toward the tent. He smiled faintly. "It's not a thing. It's the ground talking." "Talking?" "Stretching, maybe, or remembering." She gave a soft laugh. "You start to sound like one of the old hunters. Maybe the mountain spirits are waking up." He didn't laugh. "Maybe they are." The wind shifted, bringing with it the faint scent of wood smoke and oil from the generator, and something else, something wilder, hidden beneath. Ilya looked up toward the ridge. The trees there were still heavy with snow. He thought he saw movement for an instant, a shape against the white, but it vanished before his eyes could focus. Nina followed his gaze. "What is it?" "Nothing," he said. But the hairs on his arms rose anyway. "Let's mark this area and move the camp east." Because of the readings? Because of the feeling. She didn't question it. In Kamchatka, reason and superstition often walked the same path. By noon, the sun had softened the ice on the river, and the water had begun to move beneath the crust. The sound of it filled the valley, low, constant, alive. The bear had reached the edge of the forest now. He stood on a rise overlooking the clearing, where the tents sat like pale scars against the earth. Men walked between them, carrying boxes and equipment. Their voices rose and fell in sharp bursts that broke the stillness like stones thrown into water. The bear watched, head low, eyes unblinking. He could smell their sweat, their metal, the burned oil from the generator. It was the same scent that had followed the loud thunder years ago, when men with rifles had come through the river valley to hunt and map and leave nothing behind but bones. The bear's breathing deepened. His fur, thick with winter's remnants, bristled slightly in the wind. But there was no anger in him, only attention. He watched the men for a long time, until the light shifted and the valley glowed gold with thawed mud. Then, slowly, he turned away and walked back toward the trees. Inside the camp, Ilya poured a cup of coffee and bent over the seismograph chart. The needle moved again. Faint tremors, slow, regular. Nina leaned over his shoulder. "It's back," she whispered. He nodded. The movement was stronger now. A steady rhythm, like footsteps pressed into the skin of the world. "What do you think it is?" He didn't answer. He placed his palm flat on the ground. The soil was soft and cold, but beneath it, faintly, he could feel the same rhythm that the machine had drawn in ink. "Do you feel that?" he asked. Nina crouched beside him. "It's the melt, the ice breaking under the surface." "No," he said quietly. "This isn't ice. It's alive." She looked at him uneasily. "Alive?" He smiled without humor. "Everything here is—" The wind passed over them again, carrying the distant call of a raven. It sounded like a warning or a memory. Ilya looked toward the ridge and thought he saw movement again. Slow, deliberate, massive. The shape of something older than language. Far above, the bear paused at the tree line. His breath rose in clouds. He looked down once more upon the camp, upon the valley where strange sounds had taken root. Then he began to walk along the ridge, heading west, his paws pressing deep into the thawing earth. With each step, the ground gave a little tremor, as though the world beneath him was listening, recognizing, trying to remember its own rhythm. In the tent, the seismograph's needle jumped once, twice, then steadied into a slow, even pattern. Ilya and Nina watched in silence as the ink traced across the paper. A heartbeat too slow for man, too perfect for chance. The earth was not breaking. It was remembering, and somewhere beyond the hills, under the bear's slow steps, the ground continued to tremble, not in fear, not in warning, but in recognition of its oldest pulse returning. The valley looked different in daylight. The snow was gone from the lower slopes, replaced by wide fields of black mud and the skeletons of grass that had slept too long beneath it. From above, the land resembled the hide of some vast, ancient animal thawing under the sun. The air shimmered faintly, smelling of wet soil and diesel, the scent of the old and the new colliding. The earth was waking, but it was not waking gently. By mid-morning, the clouds had begun to move in from the east, low and heavy, dragging gray across the sky. The camp sat at the base of a ridge, a cluster of canvas and steel that hummed faintly with the sound of machines. The generator had been running since dawn. Ilya stood outside the tent with a thermos of tea cooling in his hand, staring at the line of smoke rising from their drilling rig. It drifted upward in a single black thread, twisting until it became part of the clouds. "Pressure's holding steady," Nina said, stepping out beside him. She carried a clipboard, pages flapping in the wind. "We'll start the first deep sample by noon." He nodded without looking at her. "And the readings?" "Same as yesterday. Micro tremors every few hours, always in the same pattern, almost too regular." She hesitated, glancing at him. "You think it's still the bear?" "I don't think," Ilya said quietly. Listen." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of the ridge, pine, ash, and something faintly metallic. He took a slow breath. "The earth doesn't lie. If something moves, we'll feel it. The instruments just remind us what we already know." She gave a small smile. "You sound like Wambui?" "Who?" "An old friend from Kenya," she said. "She used to say the same thing, that the land speaks before it breaks." Ilya looked at her, and for a moment, the fatigue left his face. "Then she's right." He took a sip of his tea and let it burn his throat. "The land remembers everything we do to it." By noon, the first borehole was open. The drill bit whined against the frozen subsoil, spitting mud and fragments of stone. The smell of oil and hot metal clung to everything. Men shouted over the noise. One of them wiped his brow, smearing it with black streaks that made him look half made of soot. Ilya stood beside the rig, watching the gauges. The ground vibrated faintly beneath his boots. It wasn't enough to alarm him, just a pulse, steady and deep. It reminded him of something living. He thought of the tracks they'd found yesterday, the ones pressed so deep into the mud that water had pooled inside them overnight. The bear's path had led directly through this stretch of valley. He imagined it walking through the fog, massive and deliberate, each step a sentence written into the earth. Nina approached, handing him a small core sample encased in a clear tube. Volcanic sediment, she said. Old, stable, perfect for mining. He turned the tube in his hands. The rock inside glistened faintly in the sunlight, flecks of mica catching the light like the scales of buried fish. Stable, he repeated softly, until we disturb it. She looked at him, then away. You can't protect everything, Ilya. I'm not trying to protect everything, he said. Just what's still alive enough to notice. That evening, after the machines had quieted and the workers retreated to their tents, Ilya walked toward the river. The thaw had turned the banks into slow-moving mirrors. Steam rose from the surface where cold air met water warmer than it should have been. He crouched and dipped his hand in. The current was soft, carrying the taste of metal and stone. He had grown up not far from here, in a fishing town that had once been full of laughter and smoke from wood fires. His father had taught him that rivers remember the sky. Whatever you pour into them, the clouds will one day return. Now, looking at the faint rainbow film of oil skimming the surface, he wondered if the river was already trying to forget. He heard movement behind him and turned sharply. For a moment, there was only the rustle of birch branches. Then he saw them. Tracks. Fresh, half filled with water. The same wide pads, the same deep impressions. They led down from the slope and disappeared into the reeds, not 20 meters from where he crouched. He scanned the tree line. The mist had begun to gather again, drifting low between trunks. The silence thickened. Somewhere within it, a raven croaked once, then fell silent. He stood slowly, heart thudding, and raised his head toward the ridge. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw something move there, a shape that blended too easily with the fading light. The weight of its gaze was unmistakable. Easy, he murmured to himself, voice barely a whisper. We're both just passing through. But he didn't move until the mist swallowed the ridge completely. Far above him, the bear walked along the high ground, where the snow still clung to shadows, and the streams ran cold and narrow. His fur was thick with damp earth, his shoulders glistening where meltwater slid down his spine. Each step pressed deep into the softening soil, leaving pools that reflected the pale sky. He had not eaten in days. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but the old rhythm guided him still, downhill, toward the rivers and the salmon that would come. Yet every turn of the valley carried the same strange scent: oil, smoke, and the foreign musk of men. The noise came again, low, rhythmic, pulsing through the earth. He stopped and pressed his paw to the ground. It was trembling. Not with the thunder of storms or the shaking of quakes, but with something more deliberate, more human. He lowered his head and sniffed. The air burned his nostrils. The old instinct, that deep animal memory that lived somewhere beyond thought, told him this was wrong. That the pulse beneath him was not the heartbeat of the world, but an infection spreading through it. He stood for a long while, still as stone. Then, slow as the thaw itself, he began to move downhill again, toward the smell, toward the vibration. The trees parted ahead of him, and the valley opened wide. The setting sun caught the smoke rising from the camp below. The sight made him pause. His body tensed, but his eyes stayed calm. He was not afraid. He was remembering. The last time he had smelled smoke like that, it had come with thunder and light, not the kind that fell from the sky, but from the hands of men. He still bore the memory of that day in the thin scar that crossed his shoulder. He remembered the sound of running, of cracking branches, of something small and young beside him falling behind. Now, years later, the same smell filled the sky. The bear moved forward again, one step, then another, slow and deliberate. Beneath his paws, the earth shifted and sighed, trembling slightly. The vibration spread outward, rolling down the slope, across the river, through the mud. In the camp below, Ilya's seismograph began to chatter. The needle danced, not violently, but rhythmically. He frowned, leaning over it. "It's happening again," Nina said, stepping beside him. He nodded. "Bigger this time. Slower." The graph paper filled with perfect arcs. There was no chaos, no fragmentation, just one long, even pattern, like breath. "It's not a tremor," Nina whispered. "It's alive." Ilya said nothing. He placed his palm on the ground again, and this time he could feel it. The faint, deep motion beneath the soil, pulsing like a giant's heartbeat. He looked toward the ridge, where dusk was thickening, and thought he saw, just for an instant, the outline of something vast moving along the horizon. The air shivered. The wind carried the cry of a raven, sharp and lonely. The bear vanished into the darkening trees, leaving only silence and the faint scent of thawed earth behind him. Ilya stayed crouched until the vibration faded. When it finally stopped, the world felt strangely empty, as if the land itself had just exhaled after holding its breath too long. He looked at the trembling paper in his hands and whispered, "We're not alone here." Above, in the last gray light, the mountains listened, their slopes still shaking with the memory of steps that had never stopped echoing through them. The earth, stirred by an ancient weight, trembled once more, not in fear, but in remembrance of its pulse. The rain began in the night, falling without sound at first, a soft, slow weeping that turned the valley into mist. By morning, the ground was a thick stew of mud and melt, the air full of vapor and the low hum of water running where it hadn't for months. The mountains were hidden behind veils of gray. It was the kind of rain that didn't cleanse but revealed, washing away the thin disguise of dust and showing what lay beneath. Ilya stood under the flap of his tent, his coat damp and his boots sinking in mud. The generator had failed sometime during the night. The camp was half silent except for the dripping from the eaves and the far-off rattle of water against metal. He breathed in deeply, the smell of wet soil, rust, and something sharp and electric. The valley was heavy with presence. Nina approached, her hood pulled up, her face pale. "The sensors are all offline," she said. "Lightning must have hit the uplink. We'll need to recalibrate everything." He nodded absently, eyes fixed on the slope beyond the camp. "Did you hear it last night?" She frowned. "Hear what?" "The sound in the earth. It came back before the storm. The same pulse, but slower. Almost like it was waiting for the rain." "Ilya," she said carefully, "we can't keep chasing ghosts. It's just movement in the thaw. The soil expands, water shifts." He turned to her, voice low. "No, Nina. The soil doesn't breathe, but something beneath it does." She didn't answer. She'd seen the way he listened, like the sound wasn't coming from outside at all, but through him, through his ribs and spine, like he was part of the same trembling. By midday, the rain had grown heavier. The streams near the camp had swelled into narrow rivers, dragging branches and silt. Ilya decided to check the banks where they'd found the last set of tracks. He and Nina went together, slipping along the slick ground, boots making wet sounds in the muck. When they reached the river, the current was thick and brown. Trees leaned toward it like mourners. The air buzzed faintly. Insects, electricity, the charge of something unseen. Ilya crouched by the water and touched the mud. The tracks were still there, though softened by the rain. Wide, deep, filled now with runoff that shimmered faintly in the dull light. "He's been here again," Ilya said softly. Nina looked around uneasily. "You think he watches us?" "I think we're standing inside his memory," he murmured. "And he's remembering that we've forgotten how to walk." She didn't understand what he meant, but the tone in his voice made her step closer to him all the same. A movement on the opposite bank caught her eye, a ripple of shadow between trees. She froze. "Ilya!" He followed her gaze. The shape was there, massive, dark, motionless. The rain blurred its outline, but the presence was unmistakable. The bear stood halfway up the slope, head low, shoulders broad as the trunks around him. His fur glistened with water, and when he lifted his muzzle, steam rose faintly from his breath. He wasn't close enough to threaten, not far enough to ignore. Nina whispered, "He's huge." Ilya didn't speak. His body was perfectly still, his pulse thudding in his ears. The bear was watching them, not with the hunger of a predator, but with the slow, unreadable gaze of something that had seen too many winters to fear anything anymore. The river between them roared louder. The bear lowered his head, sniffed the air, then turned, not running, just moving with the slow certainty of something that knew the land was still his. When he disappeared into the fog, the silence he left behind was heavier than the sound of rain. They returned to camp without speaking. The workers had gathered in a cluster near the trucks, muttering. One of the fuel drums had been overturned during the night. Claw marks raked deep across its side. Diesel had soaked into the mud, creating a slick rainbow film that drifted toward the stream. God, he came right through here, Nina whispered. Ilya crouched near the drum, touching the grooves in the metal. The marks were too clean, too purposeful to be random. He's warning us, he said. The site manager, Oberoi, approached, his face tight with anger and fear. Enough of this. I'm reporting the attack. We'll get the permits and take care of the animal. Take care of means kill, Ilya said sharply. Protecting people isn't murder. And poisoning the river is? He pointed to the slick spreading in the mud. That's the only thing he's attacking. He's not hunting. He's teaching you where you don't belong. Oberoi's voice hardened. You've gone native, Doctor. You think a bear understands borders? Ilya rose to his full height, eyes fierce. He understands better than you ever will. The two men stared at each other, the rain hissing between them. Finally, Oberoi turned and walked away, muttering orders to the others. When he was gone, Nina looked at Ilya. You can't win this, she said quietly. They'll bring rifles. He wiped the mud from his hand. Then maybe he'll move before they arrive. She hesitated. And if he doesn't? Ilya looked toward the ridge. Then I'll stand where he does. That night, the rain softened to mist. The camp was restless. Even the generator seemed to hum more softly, as if aware of the weight above it. Ilya couldn't sleep. He sat outside with his lantern dimmed, watching the fog shift between the trees. The air smelled of moss, water, and iron. Somewhere beyond the tents, an owl called once and fell silent. Then, faintly, he felt it, the ground trembling, slow, measured, like the heartbeat of something enormous buried beneath. He rose. The sensation wasn't from the machines. It came from the direction of the ridge, from the forest itself. He walked toward it, careful not to wake the others. Each step sank deep into the soaked soil, each breath carrying the taste of rain. When he reached the edge of the trees, he stopped. The mist swirled around him, dense and alive, and then he saw it, a shape moving just beyond the veil. The bear. It stood in the shallow light of his lantern, half shadow, half form. The air between them shimmered with rain. The bear's fur dripped steadily, its breath rising in clouds. Ilya couldn't move. The animal took one slow step forward, then another. The ground shook faintly beneath its paws. It wasn't approaching him in anger. It was moving like the earth itself, deliberate, ancient, sure. When it stopped, Ilya realized it was standing beside something half buried in the mud. Bones. Not animal, not fresh. Large ribs curved from the earth like pale roots, the remains of something long dead, unearthed by the rain. The bear looked down at them, then back at Ilya. Its gaze was almost human, not pleading, not threatening, but heavy with understanding. Ilya's chest tightened. He knelt slowly, eyes never leaving the animal. The bones gleamed faintly in the lantern light, slick with water. They looked impossibly old, like the skeleton of a whale that had once swum through a sea that no longer existed. The bear gave a low, deep sound. Not a growl, not a roar, but a rumble that came from somewhere beneath language. It vibrated through the ground, through Ilya's hands where they touched the soil. And then, as quietly as it had come, the bear turned and vanished into the trees. Ilya stayed there long after the sound faded, kneeling beside the bones, feeling the tremor echo through his body. The earth under his palms was warm, alive. He whispered to no one, "We've been digging in graves." Above him, the first light of dawn touched the mist, pale and cold. The rain had stopped, but the river still swelled, running thick and red-brown with silt, carrying bones, secrets, and the slow pulse of the world remembering itself. And beneath it all, as if from the deep heart of the valley, came a sound that no machine could record. The rhythm of steps, steady and slow, echoing through mud and stone. The bear's steps, the earth's pulse. The same thing now, inseparable,